Vergone. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and welcome to IAS Thursday. I want to open this event by remembering that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of indigenous people. And the university resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The IAS acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history. And this land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. So I'm going to make a few quick announcements for those of you who don't already know. There are upcoming deadlines. The interdisciplinary doctoral fellowship applications, if you're applying to the IAS, are due on October 21st. And faculty residential fellowship applications are due on November 11th. We've also, you can find information about all of these on our website along with our 5x5 program. And next week's talk will also be in this room. It's Eugenie Brinkema, who's Associate Professor of Contemporary Literature and Media at MIT, discussing incremental love. So we hope to see you back this time next week. So today's program, Reproductive Injustice, is co-sponsored by the Departments of Anthropology, Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and Geography, Environment, and Society. It's also co-sponsored by the Center for Leadership Education in Maternal and Child Health in the School of Public Health, the Center on Women, Gender, and Policy and Public Policy, and the Race, Indigeneity, and Gender and Sexuality Studies Initiative. So our format today is that we're first going to have a presentation by Dána-Ain Davis on her new book, Reproductive Injustice, Racism, Pregnancy, and Premature Birth. And I would just like to point out, for those of you who are walking around with your credit card burning a hole in your pockets, the bookstore is selling copies of this book outside, and I suspect you probably asked the author to sign copies afterwards. Then I'm going to introduce all our panelists. Professor Davis will be followed by a series of commentators. I'm going to introduce everybody first and then turn it over to Dr. Davis. So Dána-Ain Davis is professor in the Department of Urban Studies at Queens College. She specializes in Black studies, family and sexual violence, reproductive rights, poverty and welfare policy, and women's studies. And before coming to Queens in 2007, she was assistant professor of anthropology and coordinator of the Global Black Studies program at SUNY Purchase. Her publications include the book Battered, Black Women and Welfare Reform, Feminist Activist Ethnography, which was co-edited with Christa Craven, and Black Genders and Sexuality, co-edited with Shaka McGlotten. Dr. Davis is a trustee of the New York Foundation and has served as co-chair of NARAL New York and is president of the Association of Black Anthropologists. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo appointed Dr. Davis to the governor's Maternal Mortality Taskforce in June 28. And for those of you who haven't yet read the book, spoilers, but she is also a doula. So, Zenzele Isoke is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of, no?
Not anymore.
Oh, not anymore? Okay. She writes across the fields of geography, political science, and urban anthropology, and is author of the book Urban Black Women and the Politics of Resistance. Her current book project is entitled Unheard Voices at the Bottom of Empire. So, Jaime Slaughter-Acey is Assistant Professor of Epidemiology and Community Health here at the University of Minnesota. And did I totally mispronounce your name?
It's Acey.
Acey, sorry about that. Dr. Slaughter-Acey's research focuses on environmental and psychosocial factors that contribute to women's health, with emphasis on maternal and child health of underserved populations. She's the principal investigator of Shades of Color, the Impact of Skin Tone on African American Women and Their Birth Outcomes, funded by a research grant from the Russell Sage Foundation. Erin Mallory is a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society here at the University of Minnesota. Their dissertation, In the Life, African American HIV Prevention in the Age of Evidence, seeks to understand how the evidence-based medicine movement impacted the Centers for Disease Control's governance of HIV prevention. Working with the Black LGBTQIA communities and community-based organizations in Atlanta, Georgia, In the Life explores how the CDC restructuring of HIV prevention altered HIV/AIDS advocacy and homegrown prevention strategies. Please come in. There's more space over on this side of the room. Thank you for sitting on your coats. I apologize for the shortage of chairs. Carly Thomsen, Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Middlebury College, has written articles on reproductive politics published in Feminist Studies, Signs, and Feminist Formations. Currently, Professor Thomsen is collaborating on a project that examines the racial and socioeconomic makeup of the areas where crisis pregnancy centers are set up. Her book, Unbecoming: Visibility, Politics, and Queer Rurality, is under review, and her documentary film, In Plain Sight, recently premiered at Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. So that's all of our panelists and commentators, and I'm now going to turn the floor over to Dr. Davis.
So I'm bringing my medicine with me. Oh my goodness. Thank you all. How's everybody doing? Hello?
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm so honored to have been invited to give this book talk. I hope that I don't get into a coughing jag. If I do, we have a plan. This fabulous panel has agreed to help me out if I do. I want to start by saying just a little bit about the book, and then I'll do a short reading. So Reproductive Injustice is rooted in Black feminist theory, practice, and method. As such, I engage with history, gender, power, racialized affect, and effect. In collecting birth stories from individual women, I look at how meaning takes shape from the cumulative narrations in which similar interpretations validate their experiences of racism. In other words, Black women provide epistemological validity. I'm particularly interested in race, risk, and how bodies are produced and find meaning through those frames. So I took up this endeavor by exploring pregnancy and premature birth, the latter of which has been blackened, to put in quotes, by history, segregation, politics, scientific racism, and classificatory systems. My argument is that by framing prematurity and adverse birth outcomes, such as maternal and infant mortality and morbidity, based on race as the dominant risk factor, we miss the point that conception, when it is assisted through assistive reproductive technology, pregnancy, labor, and birth outcomes are relational to medical technology and to racism. Both of these can easily cohere around the capital that is generated by innovation and hierarchization. When the point of race as risk is belabored, we can end up with a managed subject. As James Doucette-Battle argues in his use of race as risk for diabetes, we can end up with a C-sectioned subject. We can end up with a labor-induced subject. We can end up with a neonatal intensive care subject. And using race as the risk to explain prematurity, I think, is to forego allocating meaning to the real possibility that racism is in fact the culprit. racism in the medical sense has to do not with viewing patients' concerns seriously, not diagnosing them appropriately because their race intrudes on thinking about the possibility of problems. It involves coercing patients. It involves scaring patients with race-based threats, such as I'll call children's services if you don't do what I say. Is it possible that cumulatively these forms of medical racism can contribute to adverse birth outcomes, maybe by keeping people away? So the arc of my argument is comprised of several points. First, I primarily draw on the experiences of Black women who've had some level of college attainment. And my point here is to shift the popular belief that Black women who are poor and low income and have low educational attainment are the mascots of adverse birth outcomes. In shifting that focus, I hope I'm able to make the point that class-based explanations, which are frequently linked to behavior, do not hold up if Black women across the class spectrum experience adverse birth outcomes and adverse medical encounters. Second, I argue that there is a history that haunts the way Black women and birthing people interpret their medical encounters. So in the book, I frame this history in terms of Saidiya Hartman's afterlife of slavery concept, which posits that there is an enduring presence of slavery's racialized violence still present in contemporary society. And I try to prove this claim by noting that the rates of Black infant mortality, among other forms of proof, are higher now than they were during the 1850s, the rates, not the number, to show how ideologies and practices that are choreographed on Black bodies, Black pregnant bodies, are contemporarily choreographed by looking at medical journals, popular press, and other primary and secondary sources from the 1700s onwards. This history, I argue, is carried by Black women, and it's instrumental in both medical developments as well as Black people's subjugation. Third, in the book, I focus on the ways that racism leaks into the care that Black women are given, and it's based on their interpretation, and this is fundamentally important. And I want to be clear that I am sharing how Black women view their medical interactions and that there is epistemological validity in their narrations, because this is part of what Black feminist framework stands by and does. In terms of the technology that's used to save premature infants, I offer a bit of a critical race analysis of saving technologies, from low-tech educational interventions from the founding of the Children's Bureau in 1912, to the development of policies to save infants, to the advanced technology of the NICU. And I point out that generally, these technologies have had uneven success when evaluated by the degree to which Black babies have been saved. And in this regard, I'm simply asking that we rethink the use of technology to save rather than the deployment of funds for technologies to prevent. I also urge us to rethink the concept of racial disparity, which I think is an ill-fitting term for the problems faced by Black infants and mothers. Racial disparities are caused by racism. Racism produces the social determinants of health. In other words, racism causes the conditions that influence group and individual health, or the differentials. And finally, I propose that doulas, midwives, and reproductive justice advocates, who I identify as radical, are very much interested in community-based forms of care. They are interested in demedicalizing pregnancy, labor, and birthing processes. They educate clients on the history of reproduction. They provide them with information about hospital C-section rates. And they help toward patient empowerment for those who want hospital-based births, because an empowered birth only happens when a person is armed with factual information. I would say that they typically refuse to be complacent or complicit with abusive systems, and that they hold protective values. I would argue that they provide radical care. So now I'm just going to read a bit from a section called Race in the NICU. Excuse me. Okay. When Veronica Newsom walks, she appears to be gliding. Sometimes when carrying her son Igbe, she props him on her hip. His legs dangle on the top of a flowing skirt. Gliding and carrying an infant is no easy feat, but Veronica somehow pulls it off. She is intentional in her speech and thinks carefully before making a comment. Veronica is a caseworker, but she could have easily been an anthropologist because her observational and self-reflexive skills are quite sophisticated for a young Black woman in her 20s. Veronica was very happy when she discovered she was pregnant. She made sure to obtain prenatal care. She took very good care of herself nutritionally. She was drinking green juices. But what did not feel right was that Igbe's father, Hakeem, who was an actor, was on location filming in Los Angeles during most of her pregnancy. Maybe that was what contributed to the solemn tone of her voice as she recalled her pregnancy. Like many women who were pregnant for the first time, Veronica said she had no idea that she was in danger of delivering prematurely. When her water broke and she went to the hospital, they disclosed to her that she'd had a premature rupture of the membrane. It was after she gave birth that Veronica took it upon herself to do research on her reproductive health because she wanted to determine the potential risks involved with getting pregnant again. She ascertained that a procedure completed years earlier probably had caused the premature birth. When Veronica was 18, she had a leaf cone biopsy after a pap smear showed the presence of precancerous cells. Leaf cone biopsies involve cutting out a cone-shaped section of the cervix, and the size of the piece that is removed can increase the likelihood of giving birth prematurely. Although there is some conflicting research about the degree of risk associated with leaf cone biopsies, the fact that no one conveyed to Veronica the links between the surgery and the possibility of preterm birth is what she found so upsetting. She was also disturbed that she had repeatedly told her doctor, her obstetrician, at the clinic about her earlier surgery, but no one seemed to take that into account. During an interview that I conducted with Dr. Leslie Farrington, who was a retired obstetrician and who was Black, I shared Veronica's story, and she told me that Veronica should have been considered high risk all along because of the earlier cervical procedure. Farrington said that if she had been Veronica's care provider, she would have requested a vaginal sonogram to measure Veronica's cervical length. She would have counseled Veronica about the possibility of her giving birth prematurely, but according to Veronica, her doctor gave no indication that she was likely to have a premature birth. I had no idea that I should have been an advocate for my care during my pregnancy. Veronica was 30 weeks pregnant when she was admitted to the hospital. A week prior to her admission, she had contractions, but they were sporadic. She was not especially concerned because false labor had been discussed at the birth education classes that she'd taken, and so she knew that she was having Braxton Hicks contractions, the intermittent uterine contractions that mimic labor. Veronica said, one morning, I woke up and the sheets were wet. I stood and water dripped down. I was freaking out. I called Hakeem and I asked him if I should go to the hospital. He said I should listen to myself. You know, I planned to have a home birth, so I was completely unprepared for this. Veronica arrived at the hospital and was put on bed rest with the hope that she would not deliver for at least 2 more weeks. She was given medication to speed up fetal development. Hakeem flew in from Los Angeles and was there when Veronica went into active labor. Igbe was born vaginally, breathing on his own, and Veronica held him for a few minutes before they took him to the NICU. He was taken to the NICU because he was born at 30 weeks. Veronica said she felt like everybody took good care of her and Igbe. You know, I asked a lot of questions. I had a doula. I had people advocating for me, including my mother and my doula. I had Hakeem's mother doing research on birthing. I was very educated. However, Veronica was discomfited by 2 things. First was the fact that her son was in an incubator, which brought up feelings of shame. And second was the way Hakeem was treated after he arrived from Los Angeles. The NICU, I'm gonna skip this part. She felt that the NICU was intimidating, especially since it was her first baby, and she had very mixed feelings about the NICU. in part because she felt that the incubator was doing her job. And she said, "It's hard to put into words. It was a vulnerable experience. I felt like my baby should be in my body, and yet the baby was in the incubator. So it was overwhelming to be hit with the visual of babies, multiple babies, as well as my baby in this thing that's doing its job. But it was doing my job. And I felt a little ashamed, like I was supposed to be doing what the incubator was doing." In a very beautiful and soul-wrenching account of her attempt to conceive her pregnancy and the premature birth of her son, queer butch-identified author Shari Moraga eloquently describes the loss she felt over her son Raphael's premature birth. "What was hardest," she writes, "what is hardest to write about is the loss that I feel of not having brought Raphael to full term. At times I think it is a loss, but then wonder if it's really guilt that I feel that my son had to go through so much suffering outside the womb because I couldn't protect him inside." Veronica's lament had a similar quality as Moraga's. Both of them felt responsible for being unable to bring their pregnancies to term. It was as if they were dysfunctional. They were being shifted from mothers in a biological sense. They were being displaced by NICU technology. Veronica had not expected to be talking about racism when she thought of her pregnancy. None of the women I interviewed did. When asked, the story Veronica told was about Hakeem's visits to the hospital. I don't think Hakeem's experience of the NICU was good. A lot of the time when he walked in, they would just look at him like he didn't belong there. They would not acknowledge his existence, and I had to negotiate on his behalf. I felt like a lot of times his hate for black men are just not welcome in the NICU because they don't expect black men to be doing the right thing. Often I felt like I had to legitimize Hakeem being there, and I think it had to do with his skin color. I'm light-skinned and he's dark. People were nicer to me, and I had to be the go-between, saying, "This guy is safe, treat him nicely." I think they've treated me nicer because I'm light-skinned. When Ipe was born, Veronica said the nurses, most of whom were black, commented, "Look how long and pretty and beautiful he is." And they would look at Veronica and away from Hakeem, as if he was not even present. There was no acknowledgement of him as Ipe's father, and while the nurses were very welcoming to other fathers who were white, Veronica said they would not want it all for Hakeem. Veronica believed that what Hakeem wore also contributed to the nurses' impression of him. His clothing choices were part of his personal identity, but they also reflected the work he does. Hakeem is an actor who starred in off-Broadway plays and television, sometimes typecast as a drug dealer, sometimes not. The degree to which the nurses were rude, as Veronica put it, likely had to do with what he was wearing and how they perceived him. If he was dressed urban, people looked at him negatively. When people saw him, they thought he was scary. There was one incident that Veronica found especially upsetting. It was when it was time for skin-to-skin contact with Ipe. She and Hakeem, as many parents do, had decided that he would participate in the process. So skin-to-skin contact is typically occurs just after a baby's born. Generally, newborns are placed in skin-to-skin contact with their mothers to make the transition from fetal to newborn life. It's a very sacred time, and it's one that should be honored. But when that time came for Ipe, according to Veronica, the nurses hesitated to include Hakeem. She said they stared him down, like he was not good enough to be a parent and to hold his own baby. In turn, Veronica said that she had to insist that Hakeem had the right to be part of the skin-to-skin process. It's what they, as a couple, had decided. Exasperation filled her account as she told me that she had to remind the nurses that Hakeem was the father and had a right to be there. So here we see a woman who has just given birth to a child, who is in a neonatal intensive care unit, who's forced to play the role of mediator on her partner's behalf with staff members who, according to Veronica, viewed him with suspicion. And so although Ipe was well taken care of, Veronica said that she felt safer in the labor and delivery unit than in the NICU. Her son was well tended to, but Hakeem, and by extension Veronica, was treated with hostility. To underscore their displeasure, Veronica called me from a cast party that she and Hakeem were attending. Obviously this is after the baby was born and he's like older. She wanted me to hear what Hakeem had to say about what it was like for him in NICU. So over loud voices and laughter, Hakeem projected his voice so I could hear. They didn't treat me like they did other fathers. It's like I wasn't even there. I saw them treating white dads with respect, but not me. So Veronica, and this is something that a number of women that I interviewed said, they said that the NICU doesn't really, in the NICU, they don't really care about the parents. She said, you come in there every day, going to the NICU, but they act like they're just there to take care of the baby. Meanwhile, hospitals are really supposed to, in this particular instance, they're really supposed to be thinking about a whole family unit. She said, and I was feeling like fuck you and thank you at the same time. I felt like each time I went to the NICU, I had to prepare myself to go in because they did not welcome me with open arms. You know, having your baby in the NICU was traumatizing. Of course, there was really no way that Veronica could be certain what the NICU staff were thinking about Hakeem, but she felt it based on their actions. And the same may be said of Ashley, another person who I described in the beginning of the book, who came to the same conclusion. Ashley's interpretation was that doctors and nurses mostly ignored her because she was young and black. Ashley and Veronica were unprepared for their versions of medical racism that plagued respectively their pregnancy and their postpartum period. Both Veronica and Ashley's encounters with medical personnel illustrated some of the more insidious ways in which race and racism played a part in black women's reproduction. Because, however, they were a little hesitant about describing the incidents as racism, I just want to briefly conclude by attending to this concept of uncertainty. Uncertainty in this case must be understood not only as the absence of proof or not knowing something due to ignorance. It also reflects a vague wondering of whether racism is an explanation for the care or attention that women receive or fail to receive. Uncertainty is a way of explaining feelings in the face of a complex arrangement of power, in this case the medical system, that promotes its own indemnification by holding up its knowledge of medicine as the arbiter of appropriate care over the intuitive knowledge of that women possess about their own bodies and their experiences. Uncertainty derives from racism, and it penetrates many aspects of people's lives, including high rates of incarceration, experiences of police brutality, premature death, and experiences of medical bias. And medical bias has a long legacy that still influences overarching approaches to treatment of patient relations today. And this is evidenced by the significant number of reports and studies showing racial bias. So it's really suspect, even if a particular counter is not definitively characterized or categorized as racist. Thank you.
So just a warning, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own kind of experience in 1975 in the neonatal intensive care unit called UNICO. Late last summer, I sifted through an entire collection of baby pictures from my maternal family. I was fortunate enough to inherit a treasure trove of family pictures from my mother's mother, Lucinda, died 9 years ago. My grandmother had kept newborn hospital photos of all of the children in the family, my mother and her 5 siblings, but there was one photo missing. It was only when reading through the first pages of Dána-Ain Davis's book that I realized why I couldn't find my own newborn picture, along with all the others. There was never one taken of me. I was born 5 weeks early and placed into the NICU for nearly a month before I was released to my mother. At less than 4.5 pounds, most of the earliest days of my life were spent in an incubator that were so graphically defined in the book. After the first chapter of this book, I couldn't help but call my own mother, now a retired staff surgeon in the U.S. Army, and ask her to talk a bit about her own experiences with pregnancy and premature childbirth. She, like others mentioned in Dana's books, shared that she felt that she was treated fairly well by nurses and hospital staff. But she mentioned repeatedly that she felt like they spoiled me. Then, in 1975, as an orderly, or today what we might call a nurse's assistant, after a few days in the hospital, she immediately went back to work. Because she didn't have a car, she had to take the bus to and from work, and from work back across town to the hospital every day to visit me. Because she was single at the time and recently separated from my father, who knocked her around a bit, but not too much during her pregnancy, she could only spend a few hours a day with me. When I asked her why she delivered early, she mentioned that she had smoked a lot and had a difficult time gaining weight. She, like other women featured in Donna's book, did not think to verbalize how the accumulation of social stressors, being in a violent relationship, working long hours, already having heavy childcare responsibilities from an earlier relationship, and others had impacted her pregnancy. She blamed herself. I could secretly tell that she envied the white neonatal nurses, and they were all white, who got a good paycheck to care for my premature infancy. Earlier this year, we started kind of studying Black feminism through the writings of Angela Davis. She has this really really profound essay about surrogate motherhood, and what it brings to mind is just how much the tables have turned here, where in slavery, Black women were forced into surrogacy to take care of and nurse Black babies. However, at this point in time with the medical industrial complex, you have a whole system who is seizing motherhood from particularly poor Black women, and especially those who end up in the neonatal intensive care unit. More than anything, reproductive justice, racism, pregnancy, and premature birth is an invitation for Black women to think closely and carefully about their own experiences with motherhood and childbirth, and to consider how these experiences are so closely tied to the history of race and race-making in the United States. Writing from a post-slavery perspective, Davis traces the continuity of ideology, social practice rooted in chattel enslavement, and how they take shape in contemporary Black life. And it's actually kind of interesting because she starts with the story of Linda Brent, or Harriet Jacobs, who was writing with Linda Brent. The most serious, specifically Davis argues that racism coalesces through different processes and practices in the sphere of prenatal birth and the admission of a child to NICU. The most serious of which when doctors and medical staff neglected to take Black women's concerns about their own body seriously, which resulted in what Davis describes as these diagnostic lapses. Many of these diagnostic lapses, from the perspective of the women, actually facilitated premature birth, and in some cases, the actual death of a child. What is novel about this work is it documents the contemporary experience of mostly professional and educated Black mothers by interviews with mothers, fathers, doulas, midwives, activists, and other birth workers. Davis rebukes the commonly held belief among medical practitioners, sociologists, and other social scientists that it is poverty and social economic status that produce racialized outcomes of infant mortality. Davis shows that even after controlling for socioeconomic status, including the age of mother at birth, income, educational status, that Black adult women are still at the highest risk of premature death, and that much of it can be traced, in her view, from Davis's view, to the internalization of racial tropes by medical practitioners and medical staff. Davis writes, because race is so fundamental to how class is understood in the United States, the medical professionals, and particularly the doctors that she interviewed, their attempt to differentiate class, each neonatal Natologists use long-standing racial tropes to make the racial other to universalize class. And the motivation to address class as a motive is what in fact makes race inconsequential. So in other words, there is a firm and deeply rooted sense of colorblindness among medicalized staff that don't see and don't acknowledge how race itself is a driving indicator. Now there's a question about whether if it's not socioeconomic status, income, is it epigenetic, then what exactly is it? And I think you have a clear point to that. In Davis's, in my reading of Donna's work, it is the racism embedded in the medical industrial complex that is creating the crisis of premature death and early premature childbirth, and even in certain cases premature death if we take the testimonials of the women seriously. And Davis goes on to argue that these beliefs, meaning this kind of colorblind ideology that's clung to by medical staff, the beliefs, she writes, are distinct from the logic of reason. In fact, in the case of these doctors, it could have meant that they did not have to consider that racism could have played a role and that they, or the system with which they were affiliated, could have contributed to it. So there's this way, there was this one section that was really particularly gripping where one of the neonatologists said, well, I'm in the business of basically making babies. I take this kind of clump of tissue or whatever, and I turn these premature, I don't even know, these babies into babies, basically. So this idea is this is what their profession is. So you have a little bit of that kind of ever-present God complex that we talk about in feminist theory classes, kind of really saturating the perspectives, worldview, and practices of doctors. There's a really kind of important section in the book toward the end about decolonizing birth. And so Donna rounds the book out by a first-hand birth account and also provides an intimate account of a conference organized by H. Song Doula, a group that, quote, reclaims the ancient principles of birthing by prioritizing natural childbirth practices. In fact, it's actually the demedicalizing of the birth experience and detangling it from the medical industrial complex it's argued by practitioners, an important way to reduce prematurity and birth-related complications. Why is this? Because doulas and midwives are trained to listen to and pay attention to women and women's bodies, rather than make use of racial tropes to justify either intrusion through hyper-intervention into the birthing process or non-intervention in the early stages of complications due to beliefs about Black women being fussy or difficult or not actually being in pain when something is actually very much awry in pregnancies. Decolonizing birth practices are rooted in community, Black cultural and cultural advocacy, and of course resistive practices. What was really kind of important about this one section is that birthing justice and autonomy was defined as the right to give birth with whom, where, and how a person chooses. And it was kind of a really kind of important testimony, like just looking at the type of work being done by this community of practitioners who linked questions of healing, bodily autonomy, and just respect for the innate processes of the body to reproductive justice in racializing institutions. So how to stay really interested in how to reduce premature death. Are you arguing that one way of premature birth, not even premature, actually premature death and birth, to be very honest, is to stay, kind of keep a healthy distance from certain types of medicalized institutions, which I found was one of the maybe overcurrents of the implications of some of the arguments based on the testimonials in the book. So you can respond to that or not. I don't know if I'm overstating.
Really quickly, I think there are certainly people who require medical intervention. But I think that there's been a hyper-medicalization of pregnancy and labor. it's not, I think that there are several things. One is, the medical industrial complex needs to become more attuned to working collaboratively with communities, with people, including their patients. I think we need to have more home births, and we need to have more birthing centers. And I think that all three of those domains need to be reinforced equally, and that way people will know that they have another option.
And the other question is this question here that came up a lot about women not feeling as if they were cared for, and how care in and of itself has to be, our concept of care has to be kind of decolonized as well too. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that and how it showed up in your research and actually your work as a doula.
So I think care is an interesting concept when you live in a capitalist society. There's a contradiction there. But I think that there are absolutely ways in which radical versions of care can be operationalized. I think this, and the only reason it's radical is because people don't do it enough. It's not that it's so radical, but it's just that it doesn't happen as often as one should want in a hospital, in a medical environment. And I think, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because I don't want to take up a lot of time, but there was a nurse, a black doula, who told me a story about how basically all she did was listen for 15 minutes to a woman who was accused of being rowdy at a hospital. And the woman was really being resistant to not being admitted to the hospital. And long story short, after 15 minutes, what she found out was that the woman was afraid that if she didn't give birth at the hospital that she had come to, she wouldn't have enough money to return back to that hospital if they sent her home. And instead, she would be giving birth at a hospital that was in her district, which is where her sister had given birth, and had a horrible, horrible experience. And it was 15 minutes of just listening. And I think I overstate, I think I talk a lot about listening, but that's part of what caring is, right, in this instance. Jaime McGlotten, I think. Anyway, she talks about listening and caring. And I've learned from the people that I talk to, the doulas and the reproductive justice advocates, and that's a large part of what they do. You listen and you learn. You find out that maybe a person isn't able to go through labor as quickly, even though there's an effacement that's at the right stage, maybe because they experienced sexual assault. I've never, with the births that I've been in, I've never heard a doctor say, you know, is there something that happened in your life that might be preventing you from being able to do this? And maybe then that's the question is, well, maybe we should use Pitocin. Not we're going to start Pitocin, which helps us speed up contractions, without finding out what the situation is. But there are a whole host of things that can intersect the person's experience. So, yeah.
I guess I'll go. So I was really excited about the opportunity to read this book and participate today, and for two reasons. One, my training is perinatal epidemiology, and so I think it's always interesting because my work tends to be more quantitative to read things that may be coming from a perspective that I think, but are coming about it from a qualitative perspective, right? Because it adds richness into the trends or differences or that are, trends, differences, associations that I may see from this population level or quantitative lens. The other side, reason why I was really excited to read this was because I'm a Black woman. And I'm a Black woman who had epidemiologists really changed in going through that process, right? So not that I saw numbers or people in my data sets as just numbers, you know, or classifications or that before, but going through the process yourself or being in the room as a doula really helps you to better understand the reality behind the data, if you're looking at it from the actor perspective, but also from the professional sense, because while our professions are wonderful and they give a lot to us, they also take from us because they professionalize us, right? And what this book does is it lends you a window, right, into the realities of other women, right, and providers that you either don't have because your social location is different from them, or you can lose because you become professionalized. And so that was very, very meaningful to me. And also, you know, to be able to sort of testify in that, you know, while my daughter wasn't born premature, right? And while I have 20 years of training as a maternal and child health epidemiologist, I've done shadowing in NICUs, I've written countless articles on this, right? That when it was maybe a week out from when I was supposed to be induced to deliver her, I felt like I was leaking amniotic fluid. But, you know, when you talk with your doctor about leaking, you don't, I mean, they're like, oh, it's just your bladder, you know. They give you lots of different reasons, because it could be lots of different reasons, right? But there's something that you cannot discount in what a woman's telling you, right? And that is a big message that is in this book, is that you have to take what these women are saying at value, right? At face value, and not minimalize it or dismiss it, right? And part of what makes this so I think consequential, right, is that one of the aspects of racism is that it is fueled by devaluation, right? Devaluation of the human being, devaluation of the word, devaluation of the relationship of what's supposed to be the relationship between a woman and her provider, devaluation between her and her child, right? Because we treat infant. So you can't split those two up. They are treating one without treating the other, right? Loving one without loving the other has consequences. And devaluation of the family relationship, which we heard about with Hakeem, right? So I guess maybe my question for you, I guess it's not so much of it is a question.
certain countries, there's still explicit racism but good birth outcomes. So we find that in Germany, find it in Cuba. Part of the reason, from what I understand, is that it's because they, in Germany, for example, and I'm just now starting to interview Afro-German women about their experiences with medical encounters. They do reimburse the same rate. So a midwife can make an appointment to reserve a room in a hospital. They have birthing houses. You can have a home birth. Whatever practitioner is that's helping you, you get reimbursed at the same rate. I will say that in Germany, there's an increase, there's a sort of westernization process happening. So there's an increase of C-sections as well. But I'm interested in what are the other ways in which we can, and I'm not suggesting that we should be okay with racism, but I am suggesting that there are examples of how they can be disentangled. It has to do with care, and it probably has to do really with single payer insurance, right? That one. Yeah, and so I was just recently in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was asking this head of the neonatal unit what she thought would help. She said, we need to cap medical professionals' salaries. I was like, yeah, okay, that's gonna go really well. But that is what she commented on. And I said, are there more people like you out there? She said, well, there's a group of us. I said, well, I'm sure that, the neonatal community isn't really embracing it. But she said that there's something about how care gets rationed in a society, and the way in which it won't get rationed is when there's a different kind of equalization. So I don't foresee that happening in the United States. But what I do see happening, so this is beyond your question, but what I do see happening is if people begin to utilize hospitals less, I suspect that there will be a change in the way in which the medical industrial complex responds to what people's needs are. Leslie Farrington, the person that I mentioned in my talk, she said, no medical institution is going to do what's right. They'll only do what they have to when they think they're going to lose money. So she trained people to walk. They just walk away. You're not getting what you need, leave. Which is not always so easy for people. But.
It's tough. And before I pass, I'm just going to say this. On the other end of being a mom, I had a completely natural labor plan with my first daughter. I went in, they didn't believe my contractions were as strong as they were. They put me on a thing that you're not reacting right. I went home, I came back, walked around the hospital 3 or 4 times. They're like, wait up, why aren't you having this baby? I want to have a natural childbirth. Okay, come in, let me examine you. Under examination, this is in Newark, they broke my water, did not ask permission, and then administered Pitocin so that within 30 minutes I was actually having these strong contractions. So when we think about the profit motive related to that, they don't make money of a woman walking around in a hospital and being under care, but you do make money when you administer certain drugs and do certain types of administrative procedures. So I just wanted to throw that in the backside of it. Being, just 44 something years, you see what it means to be born, and then what it means to give birth as Black female. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, this has been really good, and I'm really excited to read this book. It's a really good reprieve from writing a dissertation and being in the throes of job stuff. So I gave it 30 minutes a day, and I got it done. And and also want to recognize that Elijah Cummings passed away at like 68. And there's a thing where I call my dad when somebody famous who's Black dies. And the first thing my dad says is, oh, that's young. That's young. And so I think I think this book, as I think about it, is very much situated within this Black health tradition of trying to unpack and unparcel or pry apart, health outcomes and the relationship between, racism, gender, sexuality, and a lot of these health outcomes. And I want to start by kind of like how I think through the book is that, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about how we went from a social reproductive system to like a punitive reproductive system. So a lot of that money we went to for the social welfare state went into incarceration and effectively punishing people for doing their daily activities. And having children, pregnancies and births are a punitive, it's a punitive thing that happens to folks. And because it's punitive, you have to advocate for yourself when you go into any type of medical system, and it's kind of expected. And we see big movies like John Q with like Denzel running up in there with a gun and like, do the treatment on my kid, do the treatment on my kid. And it's expected that your baseline health, you have to advocate just for the baseline. And because of that, you have a lot of literatures, a lot of theories that come about talking about these movements. A lot of it's like under this notion of like biological citizenship, to where you have to fight to be recognized as like a proper citizen, even though a lot of the risks you have are structural risks. Whether it's like Chernobyl radiation, or whether it's like anti-Black racism within like hospital settings, which I think this book really, really hints to. And so kind of building from the fact that you have to advocate for yourself, even when you do advocate for yourself, the power of the ethnography in here is that you realize, oh, even if I'm doing what's expected of me, I can still have adverse health outcomes. And that's wild, wow. So you're expected to advocate, you're expected to be there, because if you don't do that, you're seen as a bad mom or a bad parent, but then even when you do it, you're denied. And I think it goes back to the ways in which we talk about race, racism, racialization within healthcare contexts, and a lot of it is subsumed under this idea of social determinants of health. And from my work, I worked for the LA County Public Health for a couple of years before I came to graduate school, and those were posted everywhere. And for some reason, we were bounding, not race as a structural component, but as something that was socially created, and it's like an environmental factor that's in our society. And I think what this book really hinted to was that because we have like backgrounded discussions of race through these notions of like social determinants of health, when we do talk about race, when we do talk about racialization practices within hospitals, there's kind of like a blank face that comes on medical professionals. And that's something that is really interesting, especially in the Southern context when the NICU, I think it's the doctor is being interviewed in Louisiana.
Yes.
And like when you talk about race, they're just kind of looking at you. And similarly with my research on the CDC, it's like, oh yeah, we handle race. It's called social, like we got that covered. And they just don't want to talk about it, at least in my research. And I think the best, it's the really poignant point here, is like towards the end of the chapters, there's this line that's like a really just deep line that's, there's never been a time when Black women's reproduction was treated respectively in the United States. And then that makes me think that there's never been a time that Black health has been treated seriously in the United States. And this automatically makes me go back to V.K. Nguyen, who has this book called Republican Sovereignty, does HIV/AIDS work in the Ivory Coast, and he has this line is, we only account for those that we want to save. And so the diagnostic tools we have to understand health outcomes, a lot of them are geared towards not understanding that racism, racialization practices, and race impact health outcomes. And because we background it, we don't care about it, we create these conditions to where we deny even the respect, the fact that these are outcomes, that this can happen. And so I tend to think of like, well, why is there's this constant production of a lack of respectability for Black women, for Black parents in general? And I think it goes back to me, to Audre Lorde when she talks about the mythical norm, and how when we have this mythical norm, it operates at the level of these material practices that I feel this book really speaks to, but also impacts the imaginary, who we expect to be parents. And unfortunately, what I think the book highlights is that we don't expect Black women, Black men, Black Black gender nonconforming people to be parents. And I think this goes back to what Collins is talking about in like the controlling images, to where you have a society that's built off of the reproductive labor of Black women, especially in a plantation context, to where you have, you know, wet nurses feeding both Black babies and white babies, providing care for both Black babies and white babies in a plantation context, and how these type of controlling images, you see them displayed, replayed all over again in our current context. And I feel that section that talks about the diagnostic lapses, the apostrophic hardness, the hardy babies, and the menacing mothers, these are like new configurations of these controlling images that have persisted since you know, slavery's time till today. And it's interesting how the medical industrial complex uses those to substantiate the fact that race isn't a thing within their places. So, and I think that's what it really hits to. And I think there's a history of this, because one of the books I thought about while reading this, and I always like to do mixtapes of like books, because like I read a page, it reminds me of other things. But like, you know, like Jada Brown's book, Babylon Girls, that talks about pinking girls, dancers who were young, and how they were never afforded the ability to be women. And similarly, I'm wondering if the NICUs for Black women never affords Black women to be mothers. It's a technology to where if you're in there, because I mean, the one person that talked about it was a punishment. I felt like they were just punishing me for being a Black woman in this space. And I thought that was one of the takeaways. I was like, man, this is ethnography, this is deep. I'm like, oh my gosh. It's like, so I started thinking through that. And so if we're never considered to be, you know, parents, you know, capable of care, unless it's hidden, backgrounded for the use of like, you know, normative society, then I'm interested in what that othering does. And I think, yeah, and that's why I want to speak to, you know, some of the intimacies that I think can come forth from that. Because I think one of the things about the Black health tradition that's really good is that we understand that racism and race and racialization practices, they involve contestation. They involve the fact that mothers have advocated to be mothers. They involve the fact that communities have stood up. It involves the fact that there were Black midwives at the turn of the century who would carry guns with them because doctors would mess with them, trying to be like, oh, you're not real doctors and that stuff. And so you have these legacies of Black autonomy when it comes to medical issues that has been kind of the force a lot of the times to produce technologies like NICUs and all these other things. So I also want to say that it just isn't Black communities and Black mothers being dominated, but that it's been Black mothers asserting their agency that's produced these technologies too, and produced these systems we have, because it's an intimacy, it's a relationship that comes together. And so going back to Lord, because like I'm always trying to be Lord more and more through everything. You know, I think of the silences, and you know, because like, you know, oftentimes people say, well, we know that this is happening. Like we know the statistics, we know that this is, and I'm like, well, we still need a space for stories. And that line within, what's the silences? What's the other part of it? It's in, yeah, transformation. Yeah, silence and action. Just this line says, that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength. Because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. So it's kind of this thing that we speak to these stories, not because like we think ultimately that it will change it, but because you just have to, because it's better to speak your truth, tell the story, than just get grinded with carrying the silences. And I think thinking through that, I'm always interested in how when we speak truth and we uncover these silences, especially around a technology like a NICU, how does that talk to the intimacies, contradictions, and the conflict within medical health studies, especially the ones that reproduce this kind of mythical norm. And so that's kind of one of the provocations. And then my advisor always tells me like, what can a geographer offer? Because I think geography is this weird space, right? And I typically think of like, you know, what geography can offer our understanding of intimacies and conflict. I think it's best described through Toni Morrison's book, Sula. Because at its basic core, we can debate this later, but I think geographic thinking is one of like differential thinking. So you have like an onto-epistemological world where everything's kind of in the same worldview, and we notice things because things are different from one another. And in Morrison's book, Sula, you have this conundrum that she outlines in the very beginning, where you have the bottom, which is actually the low-class black people on top of the white people who are on the bottom. And so that conundrum, I'm always thinking through, well, a geographic way of thinking through this is like, well, how are black folks producing that space? How is their presence in places like Louisiana producing that space? And I'm really interested, too, is in the places like Louisiana or Mississippi, and places that I think have a larger black population, I'm interested in how a black sense of place, to kind of quote Catherine McKittrick, and like the spatial practices that produce like mothers and produce like better health outcomes. I'm interested in how like the movements of like midwives, doulas, and kind of this, it's always been there, but now it's being seen as this alternative. How does that push up against the mainstream medical society? And I'm also interested in how do you think, like this question of medical dependency, and how do we get towards that medical dependency, especially in places where we assume that you need that be medically dependent. So think about the South, because a lot of the South, we tend to assume that there aren't doulas out there aren't midwives out there, and that stuff like in Louisiana, I mean that stuff like in California or Wisconsin, Wisconsin. And so, yeah, I'm just interested in how do we really work towards that medical dependency and show these other types of spatial practices in which, you know, people are substantiating the fact that they are mothers and that they are going to have the births that they want ultimately. Just want to pass it on.
Thank you for that. Who want you up first? Phil just thinks I think what you said about, the last comment that you made about, well, what are people doing in places like Louisiana and so forth? It's really striking to me that since I started this project in 2011, it is striking the degree to which there's been, it looks like a really nationally organized proliferation of doulas and midwives that are taking place. And in Louisiana, there's, I mean, the kind of work that some of the birth workers are doing down there is really pretty phenomenal. And on Facebook, there's this, like these 3 people who are just every week telling us about new doulas. I have like a 2,000 doula and midwife friends now. Right. I think that there's a way in which that they are restructuring, speaking of geography, they're kind of trying to restructure what we would call reproductive deserts. Right, so there are reproductive deserts all over the country. That's a place where you can't get gynecological, but they also call them gynecological deserts as well. But they're restructuring that terrain, trying to fill in those spaces. People are traveling, people are organizing. They're like doula meetups and midwives, midwifery meetups. And I want to say that we know that we're doing the right thing because the midwifery exam has gotten harder. Right, I do childbirth education classes with this woman in Yonkers, where we have, in New York, we have one hospital that has a 50% C-section rate. Like, that's insane. That is absolutely insane. We're trying to, you know, we're educating people about, so to us, Yonkers then, because Yonkers in Westchester County is a reproductive desert, because you really have one option, and what else where are you gonna go? So the organizing is around, you know, creating these alternatives, which should not be viewed as alternatives. They should just be part of what the options are. And the other thing that I'm moving a little bit away from your question, which is something that I'd like us to think about.
is the labors of reproductive injustice. We often think about like the medical professionals, right? We think about the OBGYNs and the nurses and the midwives. We don't think about the other staff. We don't think about the certified nursing assistants or the LPNs, or we don't think about the security people. We don't think about the cleaning staff. We don't think about all of the people that comprise the labor of laboring. And, you know, what it means to need those people. Because some of the women that I talked to, not a lot, some of them said that they got some of the best information about how their kids were being treated from the quote lower level staff, from the nursing assistants, because they were watching out and reporting back to them when other people were. Anyway, I was just looking on that, but I think this interesting, this topic of this sort of geography of reproduction and reproductive justice is something that we need to be talking more actively about, and I would love to be able to try to map, you know, where this proliferation is taking place. So for example, like the state of Missouri, I think it's Missouri, it's either Missouri or Kansas, they just got their first certified nurse midwife, like there's one. Like, there's one. And that doesn't mean other people aren't trying to help people give birth. But there's one, and it's just remarkable to me how complicated it is to be able to get into the system, to get into the system so that you can undermine the system.
I think, sorry, I just wanted to kind of add on to your comment. What you reminded me of is that, you know, organizational systems, right, which our healthcare system is, they themselves may not be systems of oppression, but they interlock with systems of oppression. Some interlock with systems of oppression day one, early on, which our healthcare system has. You can see it going, its roots in slavery, like, you know, you talk about in the book. Others, over time, began to intertwine with these systems, and the systems of oppression infuse themselves in terms of practices and policies and that sort of thing. But what you wind up with is a traumatized system trying to take care of traumatized people. And we are all traumatized people because we are living in this society that is, you know, the air we breathe is filled with structural racism, right? So whether we know it or not, we've been traumatized by racism, right? And that may intersect with other forms of trauma, right? And then we go into the healthcare system, which is traumatized itself, and it's trying to treat us.
Right.
And traumatized systems can't effectively treat traumatized individuals.
So as the fourth panelist, I figured that we would have gotten a pretty good overview of the book, and I think that we did, thanks to these brilliant comments. And so I'm going to focus my comments mostly on how the text is pedagogically useful and how it's the ways in which this text is already informing my teaching in the gender, sexuality, and feminist studies classes that I teach at Middlebury College. So just to provide a little bit more context, Middlebury College, where I'm employed, is an elite liberal arts college in rural Vermont with a price tag of $70,000 annually. Yeah. While nearly 1/4 of the most recent incoming class is made up of students of color, something that the university is very proud of, Black students comprise just 4% of the student body. Following the headline-making visit of Charles Murray, the infamous author of The Bell Curve, conversations about race and racism have been front and center on campus the last few years. I've noticed that in many of these conversations, both inside and outside of my classroom, race and class are often conflated. The phrase poor women of color, for example, is one uttered often in classes and in social justice organizing alike as a way of gesturing to those who are most marginalized. A black woman student in my Politics of Reproduction course came to my office hours to chat about this discursive slippage, noting that she is from an upper-class family and that she was struggling to find ways to talk about racism and race within such a context and with her background. She felt as if the conversations about race happening on campus compelled her to downplay her social class in order to participate, and as if they simultaneously displaced the possibility for racism in such a place among liberal elites. Racism itself was imagined as elsewhere among the white poor. We talked for quite a while about the challenges of discussing racism and classism and the ways in which the sloppy deployment of the phrase poor women of color can exacerbate these challenges and displace certain people. Let's just say that I wish I had read Reproductive Injustice prior to my conversation with this student. I will be teaching the book in my Politics of Reproduction class this spring, in part because of the conceptually important work Davis does to disentangle race and class, something that I imagine will help students figure out new ways to discuss race and racism in such an elite and mostly white setting. Davis does so, of course, by focusing on the negative birthing outcomes for middle-class and upper-class Black women, a demographic that gets ignored when class and race become conflated and when such outcomes are discussed only in terms of poverty and classism, which is, as Davis shows, so commonly the case. In so doing, Davis makes clear that addressing the afterlife of slavery requires more than eradicating poverty, though it also requires this. This is one tension in the book that I hope to hear more about in our discussion. While Davis discusses the racialization of negative outcomes of pregnancy and birthing that cut across Black women's experiences regardless of class, I found it interesting that among Davis's few interviewees, and these are the outliers, who felt as if they did not experience racism in relation to their pregnancy or birth, they themselves referenced their class position or the social capital they had acquired through becoming medical professionals. Davis quotes Sam, for example, who responded to Davis's question about whether Sam and his partner had experienced racism by stating, quote, "No, in fact, I think everyone was different because I'm a scientist," quote, end quote. As Davis notes in recapping multiple interviewees' stories, quote, "Melissa and Sheila had medical care professionals in their families. Melissa's wife was an ER physician, and Sheila's mother was a nurse whose daily visit at the hospital in her nurse's uniform signaled legitimacy. Sam worked in a science setting. None of them felt the sting of racism," end quote. Davis makes clear that these experiences, again, were outliers, and I appreciate that Davis included stories that run counter to the book's most central argument. Her decision to do so already has been useful in my Feminist Engaged Research class, a theory methods hybrid course through which students develop their senior theses. Many of my students hope to conduct interviews and also express deep anxiety in regards to both the materiality of the process itself and also what they imagine they might hear. What if their interviewees say something problematic? What if someone, what anyone who has done an interview know that's what happened. What if someone says something that runs counter to that of someone else? How can we legitimize contradictory sentiments? Reproductive Injustice provides a beautiful methodological model for doing so, through which Davis crafts precisely the kind of complicated picture of contemporary medical racism that we so desperately need. Just because it might not be experienced as such by everyone does not mean it does not exist. This argument is in line with that of feminist historian Joan Scott, who warns against crafting historical narratives rooted entirely in what she terms the evidence of experience, noting that our experiences are always already an interpretation, and second, are themselves in need of interpretation. They are not necessarily self-evident. Davis's use of interview material provides us with new ways to think through the paradox of experience, making clear that the answer is not necessarily to simply provide more and different kinds of experiences, but rather in our analyses to take on directly the complexities within stories and the contradictions among stories. Like the other panelists, I too have a question for Dr. Davis regarding how she views the relationships between feminist inquiry, feminist anthropology, and feminist studies. For example, in the book's introduction, Davis notes that, quote, feminist inquiry into reproduction in the United States has tended to focus on the development and or consequences of reproductive technology, end quote. Feminist inquiry here, and you can tell me if I'm right about this, seems like it must be referring to something other than feminist studies, an interdisciplinary discipline in which authors have focused on a wide variety of reproductive concerns, including, but also beyond reproductive technologies. As such, I'd like to hear more about how the author views this relationship between, or actually among, feminist inquiry, feminist ethnography, feminist anthropology, and feminist studies. Inspired by Davis's description of a birth she attended, I want to close by sharing a similar story. 16 months ago, I was in the room as a dear friend gave birth. She is, in many ways, the person about whom Davis writes. Despite being a professor and having access to good medical care, she is still a Black woman, Black lesbian. The lead up to her birth was stressful. Around the time she was diagnosed with preeclampsia, the New York Times expose on Black women and childbirth was published. Of course, it totally freaked all of us out, and it wasn't at all surprising at the same time. At one point, we had a conversation about whether or not it was better or worse that she had read the article. While it is a terrific piece of journalism, it doesn't offer solutions or any ways out. Reproductive injustice, by contrast, provides tangible ways for changing the current state of things, connecting, for example, what Davis terms radical birth workers to a long history of radical Black activism. After my friend gave birth, while she was lying in the birthing center bed exhausted, she looked at me and said, "Do you think this will change how you teach politics of reproduction?" That's how you know she's a professor, right? Lying there asking that question. I had watched her wife climb into bed with her and cradle her while she was in pain. I had seen her pelvic bones separate, which is a wild experience. I had held her leg while pieces of her insides literally came into the world along with her baby. How could it not? I feel similarly about Davis's reproductive injustice. How could this book not change how I teach about racism, about reproduction, and even about what constitutes feminist methodology? The short answer is it already has.
Okay. So, question is, what do I see as the relationship, the intersections between feminist inquiry? So I think feminist inquiry, I'm gonna hold that in. I'm gonna write it in, because it's almost 6 o'clock. I see feminist inquiry as a broadly, as a cross-disciplinary kind of endeavor. And so when I was writing this, I was thinking of the inquiry by any person who was in a discipline that was using a feminist lens to think about reproduction. Feminist ethnography is a type of inquiry, right? So it's both a method and an outcome. But I would distinguish between the inquiry and ethnography, although I think these things are very blurred, by the way, but I will answer your question anyway. Feminist ethnography, I think, has a particular approach that, from my training as a feminist anthropologist, requires paying attention to a strategy for change. But you can inquire and not do that. Feminist studies, to me, is this more structural domain where feminist inquiry and ethnography can live. It is so I think of feminist studies in many ways as the sort of institutionally affiliated domain where an inquiry can occur. And while I have done this, while I have tried to give these separate answers, I think that there's a between the way people use terms, how people use those terms, how they live those terms, how they deploy those terms, and then to what effect. And so, thank you, though, for the question. I want to go back to something that you said. I know. I just want to do this, give this quote, because I just think this is why you have to read all the time. But I didn't read this, somebody sent it to me. Somebody said, I found this quote, in fact, you might want to use it in a talk or a paper. So if you thought I was being rude and looking at my messages, I was. Because I'm going to use this in response to what you said. Frantz Fanon said, how can you treat patients if the institution itself is sick? And that's what I was reminded of when we were making it. And we do need to think about that. Right? If the institution is sick, if the institution is comprised of people that are part of systems that are racist, sexist, holding up all of the ways in which subjugation and domination occur because we live in that world, then how is it that they can treat us? And then the question is, and if they can't treat us in the way that we want to be treated, that we deserve to be treated, that we need to